The grain was gone. Ida Bristol stood in the ruins of the storage barn on the morning of October 14th, 1883, her boots sinking into the mud that had been dry Kansas earth just 48 hours before. The great storm had come with no warning worth heeding, and it had taken everything. 300 bushels of winter wheat, 80 bushels of corn seed, the entire reserve that was supposed to carry the Bristol ranch through to spring planting. Gone. Either scattered across the prairie like sand through an open fist, or soaked into black ruin by the relentless rain that had hammered the panhandle for 2 straight days and nights. But Ida was not crying. Owen Easton stood behind her in the wreckage of the barn's doorframe, his wide-brimmed hat dripping with the last of the rain, his jaw set hard as granite. He had ridden over from the Easton spread 4 miles east the moment the sky had cleared, because every rancher in Greer County knew that the Bristol place sat in the lowest position on the plain, and low ground meant flood, and flood in October meant starvation by February. He had come because it was the right thing to do, and because a man who did not help his neighbors in this country was no man worth the name. He had not expected what he found when he got there. He had not expected to find Ida Bristol already calculating. She had a leather-bound ledger open across her forearm, its pages somehow dry, and she was moving through the destroyed barn with the focused, quiet efficiency of a woman who had already processed her grief and moved past it. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned severely against the nape of her neck, and eyes the color of old amber that missed absolutely nothing. She wore a man's canvas work coat over her dress, the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she was making notations in that ledger with the small stub of a pencil as though she were conducting a business inventory rather than surveying a catastrophe. "How bad?" Owen said, because he had to say something. "Worse than I can fix the easy way," Ida said, without looking up. "But not worse than I can fix." Owen was 30 years old, broad across the shoulders in a way that had less to do with vanity and more to do with the kind of physical labor that bent other men before it ever got to him. He had been ranching since he was 15, had survived a drought in '79 that had broken his father's spirit and taken half their herd, and he had rebuilt what the drought destroyed with his own 2 hands and a stubbornness that was the talk of Greer County. He was not a man easily impressed. He had seen women on the frontier who were as tough as the land itself. But there was something about Ida Bristol standing in the wreckage with a ledger that stopped him cold. "Your father know yet?" he asked. "My father is in Dodge City." Her voice was entirely level. "He won't be back until the 30th, and he won't need to know the details, only the solution." Owen pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his rain-dark hair. "Ida, there is no grain between here and Wichita that isn't already spoken for this time of year. You know that." "I know that," she said. "Which is why I'm not looking toward Wichita." She finally looked up at him, and there was something in those amber eyes that was neither despair nor false hope, but something harder and more useful than either. "I need 2 weeks and I need help. Can you give me that?" He did not know yet what she was planning. He did not know that what she was about to do would change both of their lives entirely. He said yes, because it was the honest answer, and because something in the way she looked at him made saying no feel like a genuinely impossible thing. But to understand what happened in those 2 weeks and what it built between them, you have to go back to the beginning, back to before the storm, back to the late summer of 1883. When Owen Easton first truly noticed Ida Bristol, and when the seeds of something far more complicated than neighborly respect were first planted between them. The summer of 1883 in Greer County, Kansas had been brutally dry from June through August, and that drought had made every rancher and farmer in the territory lean hard on what little they had. The Bristol spread was one of the oldest in the county, established by Ida's father, Clarence Bristol, back in 1869, when the land was still raw and the railroad hadn't yet stitched the territory to the rest of civilization. Clarence Bristol was a wide man with a white beard and a temper that ran hot in the summer and cold in the winter, and he had raised his daughter alone since her mother, Millicent, had died of typhoid fever when Ida was 11 years old. Ida had grown up learning two things simultaneously. She had learned the practical sciences of farming and ranching from her father with great thoroughness, because Clarence Bristol believed that knowledge was never wasted on anyone regardless of their sex, a belief unusual enough in 1883 that it made him either admirable or peculiar depending on which neighbor you asked. And she had learned, from the books her mother had left behind, and from a correspondence course she had maintained with an agricultural college professor in Lawrence, the deeper science of grain cultivation, seed preservation, and soil chemistry. She kept this second education largely private, not from shame but from pragmatism, because a woman known to be educated on the frontier was a woman who attracted a particular kind of condescension that was exhausting to manage. By the time she was 22, Ida Bristol knew more about grain preservation and cold storage than any man in Greer County, and she suspected she knew more than most of the men in Dodge City as well. She had read everything published on the subject of grain storage conditions, moisture content, and pest management. She corresponded with Professor Elias Whitmore at the Agricultural College, who had written her long letters in response to her technical questions, and who had never once questioned her intelligence or her right to the information. She had built, quietly and over 2 years, a secondary storage system on the Bristol property that her father did not fully understand and did not feel the need to. Because Ida managed the grain accounts and the harvest records and the yield projections with a competence that made his life easier and which he was wise enough to trust. In the summer of 1883, while Clarence Bristol was away on cattle business more often than not, Ida had quietly begun to suspect that the dry summer would give way to a catastrophic autumn. It was not mysticism. It was pattern recognition. She had read the weather reports from the telegraph. She had observed the behavior of the creek that ran through the eastern edge of their property. She had noted the unusual stillness of the late August nights and the strange warmth that persisted into September in a way that historically preceded violent weather reversals. She had written to Professor Whitmore about it in August, and he had written back that her reasoning was consistent with what some of the new meteorological observers were seeing. She had begun, in September, to prepare. The preparation had been methodical and hidden in plain sight. Anyone watching her would have seen simply a rancher's daughter doing the ordinary business of the harvest. They would not have seen the secondary decisions she was making beneath the surface of the ordinary ones. Owen Easton had watched, though he had not known what he was seeing. He had come to the Bristol place in mid-September on the ordinary business of ranching, to discuss with Clarence Bristol the shared fence line on the western boundary that needed resetting before winter, and Clarence had been away again, and Ida had met him at the door with the matter-of-fact composure that always seemed to leave him slightly off balance. She had known the exact status of every fence post on the shared boundary. She had known the costs, the materials needed, and the most efficient order of operations. She had discussed it with him standing on the porch with her arms crossed and her eyes sharp, and Owen had ridden home afterward thinking that Ida Bristol was either the most capable woman he had ever met or the most unsettling, and that those two things might in fact be the same thing. He was 30 years old and he had not been in love since he was 19, when a girl named Helen Marsh had married a schoolteacher from Topeka and taken his heart west with her, which was the direction that had become east as his own life moved further into the territory. He had told himself since then that he was content. He had told himself that the ranch was enough, that the cattle were enough, that the clean hard work of each day was enough for a man who had learned not to want what he could not keep. He had been lying to himself in the comfortable, habitual way that men who are lonely sometimes do, and he had not known it until September, standing on Ida Bristol's porch discussing fence posts. October came, and the storm came with it. The storm arrived on the night of October 12, 1883, with a sound that survivors later described as a freight train that never passed. It was what they would eventually classify as a derecho, a fast-moving line of severe storms driven by a powerful front dropping out of the north, and it hit Greer County with wind speeds that no one had documented in living memory. The rain came in horizontal sheets. The lightning turned the sky into something that looked less like weather and more like the end of things. 2 barns in the county collapsed entirely. 3 families lost their roofs. 4 people were injured, none fatally, which was considered miraculous. The Bristol storage barn took a direct blow from a wind-driven tree limb that tore open the north wall, and the rain poured in for 6 hours before anyone could do anything about it. And by then the grain was either soaked to uselessness or scattered across the yard. Or so it appeared. On the morning of October 14th, when Owen arrived and found Ida standing in the wreckage with her ledger, what he did not know was that the ledger she was holding contained not a record of what had been lost, but a record of what had been saved. What he did not know was that 6 weeks earlier, on the first day of September, Ida Bristol had made a decision that she had told no one about. She had moved a portion of the grain, not all of it. She had not predicted the specific catastrophe, only the general probability of it. She had moved what she calculated as the minimum necessary for spring planting, roughly 45 bushels of winter wheat seed of the highest quality, selected by hand from the year's harvest with the specific criteria of germination rate and genetic diversity that Professor Whitmore had described in his letters. She had cleaned the seed, dried it to precise moisture levels using a small ventilated drying rack she had built in the root cellar, and she had stored it in sealed tin canisters she had ordered from a catalog supplier in St. Louis, canisters designed originally for military rations but which she had repurposed because their airtight seal made them ideal for preserving seed viability. The root cellar was 12 feet below the main house, cut into the limestone shelf that lay beneath the property's topsoil. It was dry and cool and dark, and it had come through the storm without a scratch because it was in the ground and the storm was above it. 45 bushels, enough for spring planting. Enough if she could get the field preparation right and the weather cooperated for a full crop next year. But she needed more than the seed to make it work. She needed to stretch what she had to cover the immediate winter needs as well, which the seed grain was not meant for, and she needed to find a way to supplement the destroyed stores so that the cattle could be fed through to spring without depleting the seed reserve. And she needed to do all of this without her father coming home from Dodge City to find that his ranch had been destroyed and rebuilt in his absence. That was the problem she was calculating in the ledger when Owen arrived. She told him none of this immediately. She was not a woman who shared her reasoning before she had finished developing it, because half-finished plans invited interference, and interference invited failure, and failure in October on the Kansas frontier was not an abstract consequence. It was a death sentence written in slow motion. "What do you need?" Owen asked, when she invited him inside for coffee and closed the ledger with the particular finality of a woman who had made up her mind. "I need your wagon and team for the next 3 days," she said, setting the coffee pot on the cast iron stove with practiced efficiency. "I need 2 of your hands if you can spare them. And I need you to not ask me where we're going until we get there." Owen sat down at the kitchen table, which was plain pine scrubbed so clean it had gone pale, and he looked at her across the cup she set in front of him. He was quiet for a moment, which was his way when he was thinking seriously. "You have a plan," he said. It was not a question. "I have a plan," she confirmed. "Does it involve anything illegal?" A faint, brief smile crossed her mouth. "No. Does it involve anything dangerous?" The smile held. "Depends on your definition." He looked at her for another long moment. She met his gaze without flinching, which he was still not entirely accustomed to, because most people flinched eventually when Owen Easton looked at them that long and that directly. She did not. She looked back at him with those amber eyes and waited with the patience of a woman who had learned that patience was not passivity but strategy. "All right," he said. 3 days, 2 hands. Where do I tell them to be ready?" "Here, before dawn, day after tomorrow," she said. "I have preparations to make." He nodded and stood, picking up his hat from the table. He was almost to the door when she spoke again. "Owen," she said, and it was the first time he noticed that she used his first name with the ease of a woman who had decided he was trustworthy, which felt like something significant. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't told me the plan." "I'll tell you when it matters," she said, and turned back to the stove. He rode home in the morning light that was still new and thin after the storm, and the land around him was battered but already beginning to reassert itself, the way land on the frontier always did, with a stubborn insistence on continuing to exist. He thought about Ida Bristol's face in the morning light of that kitchen, the unhurried certainty of it, and he found that he was not worried about where she was planning to take them. He was, if he was honest, genuinely curious. In a life that had become somewhat predictable in its hardships, curiosity felt like something precious. The next day, October 15th, Ida spent from dawn to dusk in preparation, and it was preparation of such precise and unusual nature that anyone watching would have been deeply puzzled by it. She spent the morning in the root cellar, completing a detailed inventory of the sealed seed canisters. She had 14 canisters, each labeled in her careful hand with the variety, date of sealing, and estimated germination rate. She counted them, checked the seals, checked the temperature of the cellar, and made notes. She was calculating not just the seed's current state but its projected state in March, when she would need to open the canisters and prepare for planting, factoring in the cellar's thermal consistency and the likelihood of temperature variance through the winter months. This was not guesswork. She had been tracking the cellar temperature daily since she built her storage system, recording it each morning and evening in a separate small notebook. And from 22 months of records, she had built a precise model of how the cellar behaved through each season. She knew that the February lows would be the most dangerous period for the seed, when the cellar might drop below optimal storage temperature, and she had already prepared an insulation system using straw bales and canvas sheeting to buffer the canisters against the worst of it. She spent the afternoon writing 3 letters, one to Professor Whitmore, updating him on the storm damage and her preservation measures, and asking a technical question about the viability window for her specific seed varieties, one to the grain merchant in Liberal, who was 2 days' ride south, and with whom she had a professional correspondence, and one to her father, carefully worded to convey that the barn had taken storm damage, that she had matters well in hand, and that there was no need for him to alter his travel plans. This last letter was the most delicate to compose, because Clarence Bristol was not a man who liked to be managed, even when being managed was what he needed. She sealed all 3 letters and set them aside for posting. In the evening, she went to the small corral behind the house and checked on the 4 horses, examining each one with particular attention to their condition and weight. She had already begun rationing the remaining fodder. She had calculations for how long it would last at current consumption rates, and those calculations had led her to the plan she was not yet sharing with Owen. Before dawn on October 16th, Owen arrived with his wagon, a heavy Studebaker farm wagon with a good bed and solid wheels, drawn by a matched pair of bay draft horses he called Lincoln and Douglas, with a dry wit that Ida had appreciated the one previous time she had heard the story. He brought 2 of his ranch hands, a young man named Jerome Cutter who was 22 and quiet and excellent with horses, and an older man named Balthazar Reed, who everyone called Balt, who was 45 and had been cowboying since before the end of the war, and who had a face like weathered saddle leather, and eyes that saw everything and commented on nothing. Ida was already outside when they arrived. She had a pack horse loaded with specific cargo, carefully wrapped in oilskin, and she handed Owen a folded paper when he climbed down from the wagon seat. It was a map, hand-drawn precise, with distances noted and landmarks indicated with a clarity and detail that made Owen's eyebrows rise. She had drawn it in the lamplight the night before, from memory, and from the notes she had in her own files, and it showed a route south and slightly east toward the Red River Territory, to a location she had marked with a careful circle and labeled simply, Monroe. Josiah Monroe, she said, watching his face. He has a working grist mill on Battle Creek, 11 miles north of the territorial line. He keeps a winter reserve of ground corn and milled wheat that he sells at fair price to anyone who comes to him rather than waiting for him to come to them. He doesn't advertise because he doesn't have to. The people who know about him find him, and the people who don't know about him buy from the merchants in Liberal at twice the price. Owen studied the map. How do you know about this man? Because I asked the right questions of the right people, she said simply. He has enough stock to see us through the winter for the livestock feed if we supplement with what I have in storage, and he has seed corn he'll sell at a price we can manage. That's 2 days south, Owen said. 1.5 with good weather and early starts, she corrected him. I've done the calculation. We leave now, push through today, camp near Gypsum Creek tonight, arrive at Monroe's mill by mid-morning tomorrow, negotiate the purchase, load up, and be back by the evening of the 18th. Balt Reed was listening from his position near the wagon horses, and Owen saw the old man's chin dip in a small, approving nod, the kind of nod that Balt gave only when he thought something was genuinely sound. What about cost? Owen asked. I have enough, Ida said, and her voice was flat in a way that meant the subject was closed. Owen let it close. He had a sense already that there were dimensions to Ida Bristol's financial situation and planning that she was not going to reveal in the pre-dawn darkness of a ranch yard, and he had the particular wisdom to understand that pressing her on it would be both useless and counterproductive. Let's ride, he said. They rode. The country south of the Bristol ranch was a particular kind of beautiful in the aftermath of the great storm. The kind of beauty that disaster sometimes leaves behind when it strips everything down to essentials. The sky was vast and clear, and the color of deep water, and the grass that had been hammered flat by the rain was already beginning to lift itself back up in the morning sun, the way grass on the plain always did, because the grass on the Kansas plain was a survivor in the most fundamental sense. The October light fell across it in long gold sheets that made the whole world look like something painted rather than real. Ida rode her own horse, a compact and sturdy blue roan mare she called Fable, because the horse had a way of making you believe things about your own capabilities that seemed almost impossibly optimistic, and then delivering on them. She rode with the ease of a woman who had spent more time in the saddle than out of it, and Owen found himself watching her from the corner of his eye in the way a man watches something that he has decided, without quite admitting it, that he wants to understand better. He pulled his horse alongside her when the road widened, and they had settled into a steady traveling pace. Tell me about this professor, he said, the one in Lawrence. She glanced at him, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, not quite surprise, but reassessment. She had not mentioned Professor Whitmore to him. He had seen the name on one of the letters she had handed to Jerome to post from the saddlebag. Professor Elias Whitmore, she said. He teaches agricultural science at the college. I've been corresponding with him for 4 years. About grain preservation primarily, also soil chemistry, irrigation theory, and seed selection methodology. She paused, then added because she had decided he had earned it. He is the reason I knew what to do before the storm. He taught me the theory. I built the practice. What practice? So she told him. She told him about the root cellar, the sealed canisters, the temperature records, the seed selection methodology she had developed by combining Professor Whitmore's academic knowledge with her own 2 years of practical observation. She told him about the drying rack and the moisture calculations and the specific qualities she had selected for when she chose the seed she preserved. She told him with the precise, economical language of someone who had thought about this so long and so deeply that the explanation was entirely clear in her own mind, and she only needed to translate it. Owen listened. He did not interrupt, which was unusual for him, because he was a man who thought through questions and tended to ask them as they arose rather than saving them. But something about the quality of her explanation held him in a particular attentiveness. She was not explaining herself in the way that people explain things to people they expect not to understand. She was explaining the way a professional explains to another professional, with the expectation of comprehension, and that expectation itself was something he found he wanted to live up to. "So you saved the seed before the storm hit," he said when she finished. "The planting seed, yes. Enough for a full spring crop if the field preparation is sound. What was your moisture target for long-term storage?" She looked at him more directly now, and there was surprise in it, genuine surprise, the kind that comes when someone asks a question that reveals more knowledge than you had attributed to them. 13% or below for wheat," she said. 12 for the corn seed. I got the wheat to 11.5 and the corn to 11.8. "How did you measure it?" "Slowly," she said, and there was dry humor in it, and Owen found himself smiling before he knew he was doing it. "I used a baking test and a visual assessment method that Professor Whitmore described. It's not as precise as the laboratory methods, but in field conditions it's accurate enough for practical purposes." "That's extraordinary," Owen said, and he meant it without embellishment, the way men mean things when they are not trying to impress but simply responding to reality. She looked ahead, and he thought he saw a slight color come into her cheeks, but the October wind was cold enough to provide a reasonable alternative explanation, and she said only, "It's methodology. Any competent person could learn it." "Yes," he said, "but not any competent person did." They rode in silence after that, a comfortable silence of the kind that tends to develop between people who have said something true to each other and are letting it settle. The first day's ride went without incident, which on the Kansas frontier in 1883 qualified as exceptional. The road was soft in places from the storm's rain, but not impassable. Jerome scouted ahead when the going looked uncertain and called back the better line, with a reliability that made Ida revise her initial assessment of him slightly upward. Balt Reed drove the wagon with the focused competence of a man who had driven many more difficult miles than these, and who took quiet pride in not needing direction. They made camp at Gypsum Creek as Ida had planned, in a stand of cottonwoods that still dripped a little from the storm but provided good shelter and good firewood. Jerome and Balt set up the camp with practiced efficiency, while Owen tended the horses, and Ida produced from her pack the materials for a meal that was considerably more organized than anything any of them had expected from a camp supper. She had packed dried beef, a small bag of flour, dried beans that she had soaked the previous night so they were ready to cook quickly, and a small tin of salt pork fat for the pan. Within 40 minutes she had hot food ready, and the quality of it, in the firelight beside the murmuring creek, was the kind of thing that makes a difficult day feel survivable. Balt ate his beans and said in his rolling, understated way, "Mrs. Bristol, you cook like someone who understands that food is important." "Miss Bristol," Ida corrected him without heat. "Pardon," Balt said, entirely unfazed. "Miss Bristol, I take your point." Jerome looked into his plate with the focused attention of a young man trying hard not to be inappropriate, and Owen caught Ida's eye across the fire, and she looked at him with a slight elevation of one eyebrow that communicated exactly what they were both thinking about the conversation, and he felt the first clean shock of genuine ease between them, the kind that is rare and valuable. After supper, Balt and Jerome settled at the edge of the firelight and produced a battered deck of cards, and Owen sat across the fire from Ida while she made notes in her ledger by the firelight with the precise concentration of a woman who was never not working. "Can I ask you something?" Owen said. "You can ask," she said, not looking up. "Why didn't you tell your father about the secondary storage, before the storm, I mean?" She was quiet for a moment, finishing a notation. Then she looked up. Because he would have worried about why I was doing it. He would have interpreted preparation as fear, and he would have spent the summer anxious about what I knew that he didn't. My father is a good man, Owen, but he is a man who manages his anxiety by managing the situation, and if I had told him what I was preparing for, he would have managed the situation, and the preparation would have become his project instead of mine, and it would have been done differently. Less effectively, Owen asked. Differently, she said carefully. My father does not know about the sealed canister method. He stores grain in open bins with a wooden floor and a canvas cover. It's adequate for ordinary years. For a storm like last week's, it would have failed just as completely as the main store failed. He's going to find out eventually. He's going to find out in spring, when the crop comes in and the ranch is financially sound and there is nothing to worry about, at which point he will be proud rather than frightened, which is the preferred outcome. Owen turned this over in his mind. It was not deception, exactly. It was, he thought, management of a particularly careful and considerate kind, one that protected both the plan and the person who might have inadvertently damaged it. He thought of his own father, dead 3 years now, and how he himself had sometimes made decisions in silence that he only told the old man about after they had succeeded, not because he was hiding things but because the old man's anxiety made things harder. You're protecting him, Owen said. I'm protecting the plan, she said. The effect is the same. She went back to her ledger. Owen stared at the fire. The creek talked quietly in the darkness, and the cottonwood leaves made their dry, paper sound in the night wind. He found himself thinking about the way the firelight moved across her face, the concentrated stillness of it, and he also found himself noting, with the careful honesty of a man who had learned not to lie to himself, that the thought he was having was not entirely practical in nature. He was 30 years old. She was 24. She was his neighbor's daughter, and she had not given him a single indication that she thought about him as anything other than a useful ally in a practical crisis. He filed the thought away in the part of his mind, where he put things that needed thinking about later and focused on the fire. They reached Josiah Munro's mill on Battle Creek by mid-morning of October 17th, as Ida had calculated. The mill was an unexpected thing in that landscape, a well-built stone structure beside a strong running creek, with a wheel that turned with a deep and satisfying rhythm, and a yard that was organized with the neat practicality of a man who had thought hard about efficiency. Josiah Munro himself was 60 years old, built like a barrel, with a white beard and hands like paddles and eyes that evaluated everything that came into his yard with a precise and unhurried assessment. He looked at Ida when she rode into his yard, and he looked at Owen flanking her, and he looked at the wagon, and he said, "You're Clarence Bristol's daughter." "I am," Ida said. "Your father's been buying from me 9 years, Munro said. Sent you instead of coming himself." "My father doesn't know I'm here," Ida said with a direct simplicity that made Munro blink. "He's in Dodge City. The storm destroyed our grain stores. I'm here because I know about your reserve stock and I need to negotiate a purchase." Munro looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Owen. "She negotiate for herself?" he asked Owen. "She negotiates for herself," Owen said. "I'm here because she needed the wagon." Munro's mouth moved in a way that might have been a suppressed smile. He looked back at Ida. "Come inside and let's talk price," he said. The negotiation that followed was something that Owen, standing in the yard with Balt and Jerome while Ida went inside with Munro, did not witness directly. But he witnessed the result, which was that Ida emerged 40 minutes later with a written agreement for the purchase of enough ground corn and milled grain to see the Bristol livestock through the winter, plus a reserve of quality seed corn to supplement her preserved seed wheat, at a price that, when she showed him the paper, made Owen exhale slowly through his nose. "That's a fair price," he said, meaning it was slightly below what he would have called fair in Ida's favor. "It's a correct price," she said. "I came prepared with comparable market rates from 3 sources." He's an honest man who respects accurate information. Did you know all along that he'd negotiate? I knew he'd negotiate with someone who came prepared to negotiate properly, she said. Which is a different thing from assuming he'd simply give us a good price out of charity. They loaded the wagon through the afternoon, Jerome and Balt working with Munro's 2 mill hands, while Ida supervised the loading sequence with the attention to weight distribution and balance that Owen would have expected from a man who had been wagoning freight for 20 years. She knew exactly where the heaviest canisters needed to sit in relation to the wagon's axle. She knew the load limit for the road conditions they would be traveling on the return. She made adjustments and then made Owen check them, and his checking confirmed every single one of her calculations, which was the moment he stopped being impressed and started being something that was considerably more complex than impressed. He stood in Munro's yard in the thin October sunlight, checking the wagon load against Ida Bristol's specifications, and he thought, with a clarity that was slightly uncomfortable, that he had never in his life met anyone quite like her. They camped again on the return trip, same spot beside Gypsum Creek, and the second night had a different texture than the first, a more relaxed quality, the quality that comes after the purpose of a journey has been achieved and what remains is only the return. Jerome and Balt played their cards with more noise and less self-consciousness. Owen sat beside the fire, and this time Ida sat beside him rather than across from him, close enough that when the wind blew the firelight it played across both of them in the same motion. "What happens when your father gets home?" Owen asked. "He comes home, he sees the barn damage, he worries," she said. "Then I show him the ledger. He sees the purchase from Munro, the seed reserve in the cellar, the winter feed calculated, the spring planting projections. He stops worrying. He asks when I did all this and I tell him, and then he does something that embarrasses us both." "What?" "He cries," she said, with a gentleness in her voice that was different from anything he had heard in it before. "My father cries when he's relieved. He thinks it's a weakness. It isn't." There was a silence that was warmer than the fire. "You love him very much," Owen said. "Enough to protect him from his own anxiety," she said. "Yes," she looked at him. "Do you have family?" "Not close," he said. "My mother lives in Topeka. She remarried well and she's comfortable. I have a brother in Colorado who writes twice a year when he remembers to. The ranch was my father's." He paused. "Was." She heard the weight in the word. "When did he pass?" 1880, he said. 3 years ago this past spring. The drought took the herd and then it took him. He wasn't a man who could separate himself from the land. When the land failed, he failed with it." "That must have been very hard," she said, and there was nothing performative in it, only the honest acknowledgement of someone who understood that grief on the frontier was not smaller than grief anywhere else, only less publicly expressed. "It was," he said. "I rebuilt." "That's what you do." "That's what you do," she agreed quietly. They were very close to each other in the firelight, and Owen was aware of this with a specificity that was beginning to feel urgent. He could feel the warmth of her beside him, not just the fire's warmth, but the particular warmth of a human presence that has become significant without announcing its intention to do so. He became aware that his left hand was very close to her right hand, close enough that moving either hand even slightly would change what existed between them from proximity to contact. He did not move his hand. Not yet. There were things he needed to understand first, things that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with not being a fool. He needed to understand whether what he was feeling was reciprocal or simply a story he was telling himself in the firelight. He needed to be sure, because he had the strong instinct that Ida Bristol was not a woman you made a mistake with and recovered from easily. She was not that kind of woman in any sense at all. They returned to the Bristol ranch on the evening of October 18th, and the unloading went into the next morning, Ida directing every piece of cargo to its correct location with the calm efficiency that Owen was learning to recognize as her natural state. The sealed seed canisters went back to the root cellar, organized precisely as she had specified. The ground corn and supplementary grain went to the one portion of the storage barn that had remained structurally sound, and Ida had Jerome and Balt begin immediately on the repairs to the damaged north wall using lumber that she had already sourced and which had been delivered the day before by a wagon from Liberal. She had arranged for the lumber before they left, Owen realized. She had arranged it before they left for Munro's, the day before dawn in the hour he had not been present for. She had been working on 4 tracks simultaneously: the trip south, the barn repair, the seed cellar organization, and the livestock feeding schedule, and she had kept all of them moving forward with a coordination that he found in the cold morning light genuinely astonishing. "Ida," he said, when they were alone in the yard while Jerome and Balt worked on the barn wall with a young carpenter's apprentice who had also been prearranged, and who arrived at 8 in the morning as though summoned by magic. She looked at him over the corral fence where she was checking on the horses. "I need to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said, entirely without coyness. "I've been ranching for 15 years," he said. "I've managed crisis situations. I've rebuilt after drought and disease and one particularly bad winter that I don't like to think about. I know what competence looks like in a crisis. I've seen it in men who I respect considerably." He stopped, collecting the words. "I've never seen anything like what you just did, not in a man or a woman, not in anyone." She was quiet, looking at him. "I'm not saying it to flatter you," he said, because he wanted her to understand that. "I'm saying it because it's true and because I think true things should be said." "Thank you," she said, and this time it was not the cool, functional thank you of the morning after the storm. It was quieter and more direct, and it had something in it that he thought might be vulnerability, which surprised him, because he had not expected her to be capable of vulnerability in quite that way. "There's something else I want to say," he said. "I expected there might be," she said, and there was something in her voice that made his chest tighten because it was not resistance. It was the sound of someone who had been waiting. "I'd like to keep coming over here," he said. "Not for ranch business. Not for the fence line. Not because your father needs something arranged." He held her gaze. "For you, I'd like to come for you if that's something you'd want." The creek ran quietly somewhere below the ridge. The carpenter's apprentice hammered rhythmically at the barn wall. A hawk turned overhead in slow circles against the deep blue of the October sky. "I think," Ida Bristol said carefully, as though she were measuring each word the way she measured moisture content, "that I would want that." Owen nodded. He felt something release in his chest that he had not known was held. "I'll come Sunday," he said. "Come Sunday," she said. He came Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the Sunday after that. He came with no specific purpose the first time, which felt strange and right in equal measure, because Owen Easton was a man who was accustomed to purpose, and the purposelessness of courting was something he had to relearn from the beginning. But Ida met his uncertainty with the same directness she applied to everything, which made the whole process considerably less complicated than it might otherwise have been. On the first Sunday he came simply for coffee, and she showed him the root cellar, which was not the most conventionally romantic venue for a first genuine visit, but which was, for both of them, entirely appropriate. She showed him the canister organization system, the temperature recording notebook, the insulation setup she had prepared for the winter cold. She explained the germination rate projections, the planting calendar she had built from her seed characteristics data, the field preparation plan for March. He asked intelligent questions that showed he understood the methodology, and she answered them with a precision that she usually reserved for Professor Whitmore's correspondence. And when they emerged from the cellar into the cold October afternoon, she realized that she felt lighter than she had in weeks. On the second Sunday, he brought something. It was a book, specifically a recently published agricultural text on crop rotation and soil improvement that he had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita, because he had thought of her when he saw the listing in a catalog, and had acted on the thought without examining it too carefully. He handed it to her at the door. She looked at it, then at him. "You ordered this for me. I thought you might not have it," he said. She turned it over and looked at the author's name. "I don't. I've read his paper in the Agricultural Review but not the full text." She looked up. "This is a very thoughtful thing to do." "I'm a thoughtful man," he said, which was delivered with enough self-deprecating irony that she smiled, fully, for the first time in his presence. And he stored that smile away in the same place where he had been storing everything about her, carefully, against some future need. They sat at the pine kitchen table, and she made coffee and they talked about crop rotation and soil improvement for 2 hours, and then the conversation moved, as conversations do when the people having them are genuinely interested in each other, to other things. To his father and the drought. To her mother and the typhoid. To the way loneliness sits differently on the frontier than in cities, more visible against the big sky, less possible to hide in. To the things each of them had built out of that loneliness, and what those things were worth. By the third Sunday, something had shifted that both of them could feel but neither of them had yet named. Clarence Bristol came home on October 28th, 2 days ahead of schedule, having concluded his Dodge City business more efficiently than anticipated, which was the sort of thing that happened when Clarence Bristol was genuinely motivated by the desire to be home. He drove into the yard in the early afternoon to find the storage barn half repaired, his ranch hands busy with the livestock in a well-organized feeding rotation, and his daughter at the kitchen table working in her ledger with the small, focused intensity that he associated with her most serious thinking. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and said, "What happened?" "Sit down," she said, and poured him coffee, and then she laid it all out for him in the precise, organized way she laid out everything. The storm, the grain loss, the root cellar reserve, the trip to Monroe's mill, the winter feed plan, the spring planting projection, all of it documented and clear and arranged so that each piece followed logically from the next, and the whole picture was not disaster but management. Clarence Bristol was 61 years old, and he had been managing ranch land since before the war, and he had seen things go wrong in ways that would have broken most men, and he listened to his daughter with the expression of a man who is simultaneously relieved and humbled in a way that he had not expected to be humbled at his age. Then he cried. Quietly, as he always did, with the particular dignity of a man who accepts his own emotion without fighting it too hard. Ida handed him a handkerchief and looked at the ledger and let him have his moment. "Who helped you?" he asked when he had collected himself. "Owen Easton," she said. "He brought his wagon and 2 of his hands." "Without him I couldn't have made the trip." Clarence was quiet for a moment. "Owen Easton is a good man," he said. "He is," Ida said, and there was something in her voice that Clarence Bristol, who had been a father for 24 years and who had loved a woman deeply for 18 of them before she was taken from him, heard with considerable clarity. He looked at his daughter. She looked back at him with her mother's eyes and her own expression. "Is he coming Sunday?" Clarence asked. "He is," she said. Clarence nodded slowly. "I'd better be here then," he said. Owen and Clarence Bristol met on that 4th Sunday in a conversation over the fence line repair that was technically about the fence but which was, in the way that conversations between a father and a man interested in his daughter tend to work, about something rather larger than fence posts. Clarence was careful. He had raised Ida to think for herself, and he respected that in a profound and genuine way, and he was not going to insert himself into her choices except as a presence. But he was her father and he was watching, and what he saw in Owen Easton over those Sunday visits through November and into December was a man who listened more than he spoke, who asked her questions rather than providing her with answers she had not requested, and who looked at Ida in the particular way that Clarence recognized from his own mirror in the years when Millicent was still alive. November deepened. The winter came to Kansas with its usual lack of ceremony, hard and cold and pitiless, the sky going the color of old pewter and staying there. The Bristol ranch held. The livestock came through the first cold snap in good shape on the carefully rationed feed Ida had organized. The root cellar stayed within the temperature range she had calculated, the insulation performing almost exactly as she had designed it to. She recorded the cellar temperature each morning as she always had, and the numbers went into the notebook, and the notebook confirmed that the seed was safe. She wrote to Professor Whitmore in late November, and his reply came in the second week of December, a long and enthusiastic letter in which he praised her methodology, addressed the technical question she had raised about the viability window, and added at the end, almost casually, that he had shared her storage methodology in a lecture to his students as an example of applied agricultural science at its most effective. Citing her only as a correspondent in the field, whose practical innovation exceeded what I have seen attempted in laboratory conditions. She read this sentence 3 times and then set the letter down and looked out the window at the snowing sky for a long moment. She had been right. Her thinking had been right. The numbers had held and the method had held and the grain was safe in the ground below the house, and spring would come. Owen came on the Sunday before Christmas. He came early, before the light had fully arrived, and he knocked at the kitchen door while Ida was still at the stove. And when she opened the door, the cold came in with him, and she stepped back to let him in, and he stood in the kitchen looking at her with an expression she had learned over these weeks to read as the specific look he got when he had something to say that he had been thinking about for a while. "Sit down," she said, echoing the words she had used with her father. "I'm fine standing," he said, which was also characteristic. She leaned against the kitchen counter with her coffee cup and looked at him. "I have been in love with you since October," he said, with the directness that came, she thought, from a man who had decided that being unclear about important things was a waste of time that he could not afford. "I am not saying this to create a situation. I am saying it because it's true and I think you should know it." The kitchen was warm from the stove. The snow was coming down steadily outside the window, the heavy, slow snow of a Kansas December, and it muffled the world and made the kitchen feel like the only warm place in existence. "October," she said. "Which part of October?" "The root cellar," he said, "when you explained the moisture calculations." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was closely related to one. She set down her coffee cup. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the distance between them in the warm kitchen was perhaps 4 feet, which was the distance that had been between them for 2 months, maintained with the careful deliberateness of 2 people who were thinking very hard about what they wanted. "I have been in love with you since the morning after the storm," she said, "when you said it was not worse than I could fix and you believed me." He crossed the 4 feet of kitchen. He was warm and solid, and he smelled of cold air and horses and wood smoke, and he put his hands on either side of her face, and he kissed her, not tentatively, not experimentally, but with the complete sincerity of a man who had known what he wanted for 2 months and had waited until he was absolutely certain before reaching for it. She kissed him back with equal sincerity, her hands gripping the front of his coat, and the snow came down outside and the stove ticked its warm rhythm and the whole world outside was white and cold and entirely irrelevant. When they separated, she was very still for a moment. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not a manageable woman," she said. "I should tell you that directly." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." She looked at him. He looked back. And she understood in the way that you understand things that are also simultaneously obvious and extraordinary, that she had found something rare. She had found a man who was not threatened by her capability but drawn to it, who did not want to diminish her so that she would fit some simpler shape, who genuinely, unmistakably wanted exactly what she was. Clarence Bristol appeared in the kitchen doorway at this point, took one look, and made a quiet strategic retreat to the barn, where he found entirely unnecessary work to occupy himself for the next 30 minutes. Christmas on the Bristol ranch that year was the warmest Christmas Ida could remember, which was not entirely explained by the weather, which was in fact the coldest December in 3 years. Owen was present for Christmas dinner, and Clarence was present, and Jerome Cutter and Balt Reed came over from the Easton place, because Owen had invited them, and because the Easton Ranch's cook had the winter off and cold beans at Christmas was a fate that Owen declined to impose on them. Ida cooked a meal of the kind that required planning, a full roasted prairie chicken stuffed with dried herbs, roasted winter vegetables from the root cellar, cornbread made with the reserve corn flour that she portioned carefully because every ounce mattered, and a dried apple cake that Clarence declared the finest dessert he had eaten since Millicent was alive, which made Ida's eyes go bright for just a moment before she composed herself. Balt Reed ate his prairie chicken with the reverent attention of a man in the presence of something sacred. Jerome Cutter, 22 years old and not particularly practiced in the management of his own emotions, looked between Owen and Ida several times with the dawning comprehension of someone who has just understood a situation that other people have been aware of for some time, and said nothing, which showed considerable growth of character. January arrived with a cold that was not unusual but was insistent, the kind of cold that settles into the bones of the land and stays there with the patient certainty of something that knows it owns the territory for a few months each year. Ida continued her daily cellar temperature records. The numbers stayed good. The seed stayed viable. The livestock stayed healthy on the carefully managed feed supply. The barn repair was completed in the first week of January, the new north wall solid and tight against the weather. Owen came on Sundays and sometimes on Wednesdays as well, which was irregular but which Clarence Bristol noted with satisfaction without commenting. Owen and Ida walked the fence lines in the winter cold because there was always something to check on a working ranch, and walking and talking were compatible activities for people who both preferred action to sitting. They talked about everything, about the technical details of what she was planning for the spring planting, about the changes he was making to his own operation, the new section of pasture he was fencing, the breeding decisions he was making about his cattle herd, about books. Both of them had been readers in the isolated way of frontier people who used books as a substitute for the social life that the landscape did not easily provide. About Professor Whitmore and what Ida might do with the knowledge she had developed if she ever had a larger platform for it. "Have you ever thought about publishing?" Owen asked. "Your methodology, the storage system, who would publish it?" She said, with the pragmatism that came from knowing exactly what the publishing world in 1883 thought about women writing technical agricultural literature. "The Agricultural College Press," he said. "Whitmore's college. He could co-author it with you." She was quiet, walking beside him along the frozen fence line. The sky was gray-white and the wind was down, and the silence of the winter prairie had its own quality, immense and clean. "He mentioned something similar in his last letter," she said. "He suggested a joint paper for the college's agricultural journal. Would you do it?" "I'm thinking about it," she said. "Your name on the paper," he said. "Not just his, your name." She looked at him. "That matters to you." "It matters to me," he said very directly, "because it's your work." They walked on, and the afternoon was cold and clear, and she thought that she had been right about the farm, and she had been right about the grain, and she had been right about the spring, and she was beginning to believe that she had also been right about this particular man walking beside her in the winter cold with his hands in his coat pockets, and his eyes on the horizon but his attention entirely on her. In February, the cold was at its worst, and Ida's insulation system in the root cellar was tested. The temperature dropped below the lowest point she had recorded in her 22 months of tracking, and she spent 3 anxious days monitoring the cellar twice daily and making small adjustments to the straw bale placement. The numbers stayed just above her critical minimum threshold. The seeds stayed viable. She wrote to Professor Whitmore about the cold snap and the insulation response, and his reply, arriving 3 weeks later, was enthusiastic about the insulation design and suggested 2 modifications for future use that she noted carefully. Owen came during the cold snap on a Wednesday unannounced, which she had told him was acceptable, and found her at the cellar entrance with her temperature notebook, looking focused and a little worried in the specific way she looked when the world was not perfectly within the parameters she had planned for. "How is it?" he asked. "Within tolerance," she said, "but barely. I've added another layer of straw bailing on the east wall and I'll check again this evening." "Can I help?" She considered this. "You can carry the straw," she said. "I'll do the placement." He carried the straw without comment, and she placed it exactly as she needed it. And then they climbed back out of the cellar into the cold afternoon, and she made coffee and they sat at the table, while the wind moved around the corners of the house, with the sound that wind makes when it is serious about its work. "I'm going to ask you something," Owen said, "and I want you to think about it properly before you answer, not just give me the first response that comes to you." She put down her coffee cup and looked at him with the full, unhurried attention she gave to things that were important. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to do it before the spring, because I want to go into the planting season as your husband and not your neighbor, and because I have been more certain about this than I have been about almost any other decision in my adult life." He paused. "But I know that marriage in 1883 means legal things that are unfair to you, and I know that you know it too, and I want to say clearly that I intend to run our ranch together, not for you to run my ranch for me and call it ours. What's yours stays yours. What decisions are yours to make stay yours to make. I don't want your intelligence or your independence. I want them to continue." He said all of this in the straight, declarative way he had, without embellishment and without hedging. Ida was quiet for a long moment. She was thinking, which he had learned to recognize as looking straight at him in a way that went slightly past him, as though she was reading something written in the middle distance. "My father will want to be consulted," she said. "I already consulted him," Owen said. "Yesterday," she blinked. "And he told me that the decision is entirely yours," Owen said. And then he shook my hand. A slow, complete smile moved across her face. "Of course he did," she said. She looked at Owen, and he looked back at her, and the winter light came through the window and lay across the table between them. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen while the cold pressed against the outside of the house and held no power at all over what was happening inside it. The wedding was on the 1st of March, 1884, in Greer County, attended by Clarence Bristol, Jerome Cutter, Balt Reed, three neighboring families who came through the late winter mud because they liked both parties and respected what they represented individually and together, and a minister from Liberal named Reverend Colquitt, who performed the ceremony in the Bristol parlor with the brisk warmth of a man who enjoyed his work, and found this particular ceremony more interesting than most. Ida wore her mother's dress, which she had taken in at the waist and let out at the shoulders, because she was built differently from Millicent, taller and stronger through the back, and the dress fit her the way things fit when they have been adjusted carefully by someone who understands exactly what she is working with. She stood beside Owen, and the light from the parlor windows caught the amber in her eyes and made them look like something found in the earth rather than something worn on a face. Owen looked at her in the way that Balt Reed later described to Jerome Cutter as the look of a man who cannot believe he lives in the same world as what he's looking at, which was the most emotional statement Balt Reed had ever been observed to make, and which Jerome preserved carefully in his memory. They said the words and they meant them, and Clarence Bristol sat in the first chair and held his composure with both hands and mostly succeeded. The week after the wedding, Ida opened the root cellar on the first genuinely warm morning of the season, when the temperature of the air outside matched the target she had calculated for beginning the pre-planting seed preparation, and she brought up the 14 sealed canisters that had been down there since September. She opened each one in the warm kitchen and examined the seed with the methodical care of a woman, reclaiming something she had trusted to the earth. The wheat seed was bright and clean, and when she ran the germination test she had learned from Professor Whitmore's letters, placing seed samples between damp cloth and counting the sprouting percentage over 48 hours, the result was 93% germination rate. for seed that had been in storage 6 months through a Kansas winter, including the worst cold snap in 3 years. This was exceptional. This was, as she wrote to Professor Whitmore that same evening, a vindication of the methodology that she intended to share with as many people as possible. Owen came in from the fields where he had been preparing the ground for planting, because they had agreed to work the Bristol fields and the Easton fields together as a single operation, rationalizing the labor and the equipment, and he found her at the kitchen table with the germination test samples laid out, and her notebook open, and her face carrying an expression that he had been learning, through months of careful observation, to identify precisely. It was the expression of a woman whose calculations have proven correct, and it had a particular quality of quiet satisfaction that she allowed herself only in moments of genuine accomplishment. "Good numbers," he said. 93%, she said. He sat down across from her and looked at the samples. "That's extraordinary," he said. "That's methodology," she said, with the slight smile that he had come to love specifically because it appeared only in these moments when she allowed herself to be completely pleased with her own work. "That's your methodology," he said. "That belongs to you." She looked at him. "And to Professor Whitmore's letters." "You built the application," Owen said. "You built the insulation. You did the temperature records. You made the decision to preserve before the storm hit. He was looking at her steadily. "That matters." "I'm writing the paper," she said. "We talked about it. Whitmore and it will have both our names, but I'm writing the sections on field application." "Good," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. "You say good," she said, "and you mean it." "I mean it," he said simply. She stood up, crossing from the table to where he sat, and she put her hand on his shoulder and he reached up and covered it with his own. And for a moment they were just two people in a warm kitchen with seed samples on the table, and the spring coming through the windows, and it was enough. Planting began in the second week of March, slightly later than a perfectly ideal year would have allowed, but well within the viable window for the variety of wheat she was using. Ida managed the seed distribution with a precision that made Jerome Cutter watch her at work, with the expression of someone learning a skill they had not known they lacked. She planted in the field sections she had identified through her soil assessment the previous fall, using a rotation strategy that she had developed from Professor Whitmore's recommendations and her own observations of the land's drainage patterns. Owen worked beside her and behind her, and when she needed it, ahead of her, reading the land's surface in the way that 15 years of working a specific piece of ground teaches a person, knowledge that was different from Ida's but not lesser, and which she valued and used without the slightest sense of competition. They were, in the planting, a genuinely effective team, each bringing knowledge that complemented the others, and neither of them had to pretend otherwise. Clarence Bristol worked the lighter tasks during planting, because his back was not what it had been and Owen had told him so directly, and he had accepted this without the pride that might have made it difficult, because he was a man who had always been able to tell the truth from flattery, and he could see that the operation was in better hands than his alone. April came, and the wheat came with it. The first emergence of the seedlings from the winter wheat was, as it always was, the thing that vindicated every decision of the previous 6 months. Ida walked the rows in the morning light of the second week of April, and the emergence rate was consistent with the germination test results, which meant 93% of what she had planted was coming up, which was a number that even the most experienced men in Greer County would have considered exceptional for any year, let alone the spring after a catastrophic storage loss. She stood in the middle of the field and she looked at what the winter had preserved, and the spring was returning, and she allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but was a combination of both things and also something harder to name, the satisfaction of a person who has bet their best knowledge against a difficult situation and been proven right. Owen came up beside her and he looked at the field and he said nothing, because the field said everything and he understood that. She put her hand in his. They stood there together in the April morning with the green just barely visible in the dark Kansas soil, and the sky above them was the clearest blue that the prairie allows, the blue that comes after a long winter and before the heat of summer, the blue that is precisely and only that moment. By July, the wheat was standing tall, green, going gold in the summer heat, and it was going to be a good harvest. Not an exceptional harvest by the measure of ideal years, but a sound, solid, honest harvest, the kind that comes from careful preparation and good methodology, and a willingness to make hard decisions before circumstances force them. Owen and Ida rode the fields together on a July evening when the light was long and gold, and the wheat moved in the light breeze in the way that wheat moves when it is ready, which is the most beautiful motion in the world to people who have worked for it. Fable moved steadily beneath Ida, and Owen's horse moved beside her, and the two of them were quiet for a long time, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate most about him, that he could be quiet with her without filling the silence with things that didn't need to be said. Whitmore wrote back, she said, eventually. And, the paper is accepted, she said. The Agricultural Journal at the college. They want it for the fall issue. Owen turned to look at her. Ida Bristol Easton on the masthead. Ida Bristol Easton, she confirmed, with the steadiness of a woman who has decided that her name on a thing matters and who is not going to qualify that belief. He reached across the gap between the horses and found her hand and squeezed once and let go, because they were on horseback and the horses required attention, but the squeeze said what needed to be said. The harvest came in August, golden and heavy in sound, and they worked it together with the full crew of both spreads, Jerome and Balt and 3 seasonal hands Owen had taken on, and Clarence Bristol on the lighter end of the work with a persistence that no one argued with any more. The numbers that came in from the harvest exceeded Ida's most optimistic projection by 11%, which she attributed to the specific seed selection methodology she had used and the soil preparation work they had done in spring. She wrote this finding in a supplementary note to Professor Whitmore and added it to the paper as a concluding data point. The new storage barn, rebuilt and improved over the summer with Owen's hands doing much of the additional construction work, was sound and well sealed, and set on a foundation that accounted for drainage in a way the old barn had not. Ida had consulted on the design, and Owen had built to her specifications without treating this as anything unusual, because for them it was not unusual. It was simply how they worked. The grain went into the new barn in August with all the ceremony that the end of a difficult season deserves, which is to say, no ceremony at all, just the clean, steady work of people who understand what they are doing and why it matters. In the evening after the last of the harvest was in, Clarence Bristol sat on the porch with a glass of the good whiskey he kept for genuine occasions, and he watched the sunset go red and gold over the Kansas plain, and he said to the air, or to Millicent, or to no one in particular, that things had turned out well. Which was the most he would say about it, because he was Clarence Bristol and he was not given to excessive sentiment, except when he was crying with relief, which he did once more that evening, quietly and alone on the porch in the good way, the way that means everything has come right. On an October evening, exactly 1 year after the storm that had destroyed the grain supply and set everything in motion, Ida sat at the kitchen table with her ledger and Owen sat across from her with a cup of coffee, and the silence between them was the particular silence of a house that is properly inhabited, that has been used for the right purposes, and has become the kind of place that holds warmth against the cold and meaning against the emptiness of the big sky outside. She looked up from the ledger and found him watching her, not with the covert attention of a man trying to look without being seen, but with the open, direct attention of a man who had long ago decided to stop hiding the fact that looking at her was something he chose to do. "What?" she said, because his expression was particular. "I'm thinking about the fence line on the northern boundary," he said. "It needs resetting before winter." "I know," she said. I have it in the ledger for next week." "I thought you might," he said. She returned to the ledger, he returned to his coffee. The stove ticked. Outside, the October evening was cold and clear, the stars coming up over the prairie with the punctual certainty of things that exist entirely outside human concerns and are entirely beautiful for it. "Owen," she said. "Yes." "I'm going to have a child," she said, looking at him from across the table, calm and direct and entirely present. "Spring, I think, by the calculation." The coffee cup stayed in his hand but was entirely forgotten. He looked at her, and she looked back, and the expression that moved across his face was one that she had never seen from him before, something unguarded and enormous, the expression of a man confronted by joy that he had not known how to expect. He put the coffee cup down and came around the table, and she stood to meet him, and he held her in the way that she had learned he held things he cared about completely, with a steadiness that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with commitment. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm perfectly well," she said against his shoulder. "I'm excellent, in fact." "A spring child," he said. "A spring child," she confirmed. "Like the wheat." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely, and she felt it move through him, and she thought about the grain in the new barn, and the seed that had come through the winter, and the field that had given back what the storm had tried to take. And she thought that she understood something about seasons and preservation and the specific stubbornness of things that choose to persist. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was milder than the previous one, which Ida's temperature records confirmed, and which everyone in Greer County was grateful for. She continued her records through the winter, now tracking both the grain storage cellar and a new set of observations she had begun about the relationship between winter temperature patterns and spring germination timing. She was gathering data for a second paper, which she had not yet told Professor Whitmore about, but which was already organized in her mind, with the particular clarity of an argument she had been thinking about for a long time. Owen managed more of the heavy outdoor work as the winter deepened, and she moved through her pregnancy with the practical no-nonsense approach she applied to everything, tracking her own condition with the same methodical attention she gave the temperature records. She was healthy and she knew it, and she managed the situation accordingly. Their son was born on March 18, 1885, in the Bristol farmhouse, attended by the doctor from Liberal, who made the 2-hour ride without complaint, because Owen had ridden to get him with the particular urgency that made a man not want to ask unnecessary questions. The boy was large and healthy and loud in the specific way that announces a strong constitution, and Clarence Bristol, waiting in the parlor, heard the first cry come through the bedroom door and bowed his head over his folded hands and said something quiet that was his own private business. Owen was present for the birth, because Ida had informed the doctor that her husband would be present, and this was not a matter open for discussion, and the doctor, who was a sensible man, had made no objection. Owen held her hand through the worst of it, and she gripped his hand with a strength that surprised even her, and he did not flinch, because he was Owen Easton, and flinching was not something he did when it mattered. When the baby was placed in his arms for the first time, Owen stood very still and looked at the small, furious, remarkable face, and he was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, completely without words. "Henry," Ida said from the bed, with the particular authority of a woman who has earned the right to make this decision without negotiation. "Henry Clarence Easton." Owen looked at the baby and then at her. Clarence Bristol, who had been allowed in by this point, heard his name and had to look at the ceiling with great concentration. "Henry Clarence Easton," Owen said, and his voice was different than his usual voice in a way that Ida stored away carefully in the part of her that held the things she wanted to remember precisely. Henry Clarence Easton came into the world in March and grew through the spring in the way that healthy, well-loved children do, with the particular speed that always surprises people who have not been paying close enough attention. He was 3 months old when the spring wheat came in for the second year, Another good harvest. And Ida walked the rows with him bundled against her, in a way she had devised from cotton canvas, watching the field with the same attention she had always given it. She published the paper in the College Agricultural Journal in October of 1885, 2 years after the storm. The authorship read, Bristol Easton, I. and Whitmore, E.J., and the title addressed grain preservation methodology in field conditions with specific reference to sealed canister storage and cellar temperature management. It was 4,000 words long, and it was precise and practical, and it was entirely correct. 3 months after publication, she received 17 letters from agricultural correspondents in 5 states, all of them asking technical questions about the methodology, most of them astonished, and some of them deliberately failing to mention the female first initial. She answered every letter in the same calm, detailed manner, and the questions that were useful she passed on to Professor Whitmore, and the responses that were condescending she set aside without anger, because she had been managing condescension since she was 14, and it had long ago stopped being capable of touching her. Professor Whitmore wrote that the paper had been discussed at 2 regional agricultural conferences, and that several county extension programs had inquired about implementing the methodology. Ida read this letter at the kitchen table and felt the particular satisfaction of useful knowledge traveling beyond its origin point. Owen read the letter over her shoulder, having come in from the fields, and said, I'd say I told you so, but I don't think you need me to. You can say it, she said. Just this once. I told you so, he said, with a smile that she had come to classify as one of her favorite things in her world. Henry, sitting in the wooden chair Clarence had made for him, looked at both of them with the focused, solemn attention of a 10-month-old, who is deeply invested in the emotional texture of any room he is present in, and said something that was not yet a word, but was clearly intended as a contribution. The years that followed were good ones. Not untroubled, because nothing on the frontier was untroubled, and the land had its difficult seasons as it always would, but good in the fundamental sense of a life built on correct foundations. The combined Easton-Bristol operation grew steadily, the grain methodology reducing storage losses to the lowest rates in the county, the record-keeping providing year-over-year data that improved each season's decisions. Clarence Bristol spent more time on the porch and less time in the field as the years moved, and he spent considerable time with Henry, teaching the boy the things he had taught Ida, reading to him from the books that had been Millicent's, watching with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understands that legacy is not a building or a herd of cattle, but a child who has learned to love thinking. In the spring of 1887, their second child arrived, another boy they named James Balthazar Easton, the middle name chosen because Balt Reed had become, over the years, a constant and quietly indispensable presence in their lives, a fact which Balt himself received with the dignified composure of a man who had always known his own worth, but was not accustomed to having it acknowledged quite so directly. Jerome Cutter, now 26 and running a small operation of his own 2 miles from the Easton spread, was present for the celebration dinner, and said that James looked like a solid individual with a future in horse management, which was the highest compliment Jerome was capable of paying. Ida, nursing James and reviewing the spring planting schedule simultaneously, looked at Owen across the table, and he looked back at her with the open, uncomplicated love of a man who had never stopped being astonished that his life had arranged itself into this particular shape. In the fall of 1888, a third child arrived, this time a girl, whom they named Millicent Ida Easton, and Clarence Bristol, 67 years old and slower now but still sharp, came into the house to meet his granddaughter and held her in his large, weathered hands and called her by her name, which was also his wife's name, and said nothing at all for a long moment, while everyone in the room found something to occupy their attention. The Bristol farmhouse and the Easton ranch house had by this point been connected in every practical sense. The operations merged, the families merged, the histories merged into something that was neither Bristol nor Easton but both, and something new. The storage systems that Ida had developed were now the standard for both properties and had been adopted, through the dissemination of her published methodology, by farms across 3 counties. People came to her with questions, sometimes traveling considerable distances to do so, and she answered them at the kitchen table with the same direct precision she had always applied to useful knowledge. She wrote a second paper in 1889 with Professor Whitmore, this one addressing the relationship between winter temperature patterns and optimal spring planting timing, and it was better than the first because she had 4 years of additional data, and because she had become, through the years of practice, a clearer and more confident writer of technical prose. Owen read both papers and asked her intelligent questions about both, and she told him that he was her most useful reader because he caught the places where she had assumed knowledge that the reader might not have and needed her to explain more fully. He said that was what came of being someone who had had to catch up rather than having been there from the beginning. She said it was what came of being a careful reader, which was rare, and he accepted this assessment and went back to his reading. Balt Reed, who was not given to speeches or sentimentality, arrived at the Easton place one November evening in 1890 with his saddle and his bag, and informed Owen that he was too old for winter work in his current accommodation, which was a bunkhouse that had seen better decades, and that if there was a room that could be made available at the ranch house, he would prefer to spend the winter there, paying his way in whatever capacity his back allowed. Owen said that there was a room and it required no payment other than his company, and Balt moved in with the decisive efficiency of a man who has thought about this for some time and is glad to have it settled. He lived with them for the remaining years of his life, which were 7, and in that time he taught Henry and James things about horses and cattle and the reading of land and weather that no book contained, and he told Millicent stories about his years on the trail that she demanded repeatedly with the particular insistence of a small person who knows exactly what she wants. And he was, in the way of people who have found the right place late in life, entirely content. Jerome Cutter married a young woman named Clara Abbott in 1891, and their wedding was celebrated at the Easton place because it was larger, and Ida cooked a meal of such quality that Clara, who was 21 and had grown up in a larger town and had certain assumptions about frontier life, looked around the table at the gathered people and felt the specific relief of someone who has arrived somewhere and found it better than she had feared. The years move the way they do, with the particular combination of speed and weight that becomes more apparent as you get older, and what they left behind at the Easton-Bristol spread was the accumulated result of good decisions, hard work, and the particular genius of a woman who had known before the storm came how to preserve what mattered through the winter and bring it safely to spring. Clarence Bristol died in the spring of 1893, on a mild April morning when the wheat was just beginning to come up in the field, which was the right time and the right way for a man who had given his life to the land to make his departure from it. He died in his chair on the porch, and the doctor who came afterward said he had gone quietly and without suffering, which was what everyone had hoped for. Ida stood at the edge of the field that evening while the last light went golden over the Kansas plain, and Owen stood beside her, and neither of them spoke, because Clarence Bristol had raised a daughter who knew when silence was the right language. They buried him beside Millicent on the south slope of the property, where the land was highest and the view was farthest, and Henry, 8 years old and solemn in his good clothes, held his mother's hand and asked her that evening whether his grandfather had known that he was loved. She told him yes, absolutely, without any possibility of doubt, and Henry nodded and said that was the important thing, and she looked at him and thought that Clarence had done his work well. The spring of 1893 was a good planting year, and the harvest that summer was the best in Easton memory, which Ida recorded in the ledger that was now the sixth consecutive ledger in a series that dated back to September of 1883, to the days before the storm. She kept the ledgers, all of them, stacked neatly on the shelf in the study that had been organized with the same methodical care she gave everything. The first ledger, the one she had been holding in the ruined barn when Owen arrived that October morning, occupied a particular place on the shelf, and occasionally she took it down and looked at the entries from those days, the calculations, the projections, the plan taking shape in her handwriting on pages that she had kept dry through everything. Owen found her with it one evening and sat beside her at the study desk while she turned the pages. "You had already decided," he said, looking at the entries. "I had already decided," she confirmed, "even before I came." "Even before," she said, "though it was considerably easier with your wagon and your two hands." "And my company," he said. She looked at him. "And your company," she said, with the slight, specific smile that still appeared when she was entirely pleased with something. "Considerably." Henry was 17 in 1902, tall and thoughtful in the way of his mother, and he had read every agricultural text his mother owned and had begun a correspondence of his own with the agricultural college, which produced in Ida a satisfaction that she expressed by teaching him everything she knew about the ledger system. James was 15, and already the most capable young horseman in the county, which would have made Balt Reed quietly proud if he had still been present to see it. Millicent was 13 and had opinions about everything, and expressed them clearly and often, which was entirely characteristic, and which her parents regarded with the wry, resigned affection of people who have recognized their own traits in someone they love. Owen watched his children in the evenings with the particular attention of a man who finds his own life continually astonishing in retrospect, who cannot quite reconcile the man he had been in the fall of 1883, sitting alone in a ranch house with his father's grief around him like weather, with the man he was now, in a house full of intelligence and argument, and the particular noise of a family that is actually paying attention to each other. He said this to Ida one evening in October, 20 years after the storm, sitting on the porch that had been extended and improved over the years into something genuinely comfortable, with the good chairs and the view west that she had decided in their first spring together would be the thing she most wanted to look at in the evenings. She was 54 years old and he was 60, and these numbers were not abstractions but evidence. And the evidence was that they had built something that had lasted through all the seasons the land could produce and had not diminished. She listened to what he said, and then she was quiet for a moment, and the evening was warm for October, the late harvest warmth that Kansas sometimes allows before the cold comes, and the stars were beginning to appear at the edge of the sky. "I think about the cellar," she said. "Sometimes, those 14 canisters." "Seed enough for spring," he said. "Seed enough for spring," she agreed. That was all it was, the calculation, the preparation, the decision to preserve what mattered before the storm hit. She looked at him. "That's all any of it was." "That's not all it was," he said. She looked at him. "It was you," he said simply. "All of it was you." She took his hand, the way she had taken it in the field 20 years ago when the wheat was just coming up, and held it in the October evening, and the sky above the Kansas plain was enormous and clear and full of the particular kind of light that has traveled a very long way to arrive, and they sat in it together, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything. Henry went to the agricultural college in Lawrence the following year, 19 and ready in every sense, carrying in his bag 6 books his mother had selected, and a letter of introduction from Professor Whitmore, who at 73 was still corresponding with Ida Bristol Easton, and still calling her the most rigorous applied scientist he had encountered in 40 years of academic life. James stayed on the land, because it was where he belonged and where he wanted to be, and worked beside Owen with a physical competence and a love for the cattle and the horses that was its own kind of intelligence, fully equal to any other kind. Millicent announced at 15 that she intended to become a doctor, and said this with the particular certainty of someone who has already thought it through completely and is only informing rather than proposing. And Owen looked at Ida, and Ida looked at Owen, and both of them recognized the expression on their daughter's face, and neither of them argued. In the spring of 1905, Henry Clarence Easton came home from 2 years of graduate study in agricultural science with a research project on soil improvement methods, and a wife named Ruth who was 23, and had a mind that Ida recognized on first meeting and welcomed with the warmth of someone encountering a kindred spirit. James Easton married Clara Abbott's younger sister, Anna, in 1906, a pairing that Jerome Cutter declared inevitable, and that Anna herself had probably decided on before James had formed a clear opinion, which was characteristic of the Abbott women generally. Millicent Easton left for her medical studies in 1907, having secured a place at a women's medical college in Pennsylvania through a combination of academic achievement and sheer force of will. And Ida saw her off at the train station in Liberal, with the complex emotion of a mother watching a child become exactly what she was supposed to become. The ranch held and grew and continued, the way good things do when they have been properly founded. The grain methodology that Ida had developed in the fall of 1883, born from the combination of Professor Whitmore's scholarship and her own practical intelligence and the specific crisis of a great storm, continued to spread through the counties around them, adapted and improved by other hands on other pieces of ground. The paper she had published was cited in subsequent agricultural literature through the 1890s and into the new century, and she received letters about it as late as 1910 from practitioners who had implemented the methodology and wanted to report their results. Each letter she answered at the desk in the study where the 6 ledgers stood on the shelf. The first ledger was always there, the record of the first days after the storm, the calculations in her careful hand that had looked at catastrophe and found the path through it. She did not keep it for sentiment, exactly, though sentiment was part of it. She kept it because it was the best evidence she had of a principle she believed completely, which was that the worst situations reveal the most important things, about the land, about methodology, about what you are willing to do when it is difficult, and about the people who stand beside you when the storm has passed and the work of rebuilding begins. Owen lived into his 79th year, and he was healthy and present until close to the end, which was the spring of 1912, a day in April when the wheat was coming up in the field, and the sky was the right blue, and the world was doing what it always did, continuing without pause or apology. He died in the house he and Ida had made together, in the bedroom that faced east to catch the morning light, with Ida beside him and Henry and James and Millicent, who had come home from Pennsylvania for the occasion and who held his hand in the way doctors learn to hold hands, with the knowledge of what the hand contains. He said near the end, "The first ledger." She understood what he meant. She went and got it from the shelf and brought it to him, and he held it, the old leather cover soft with years. "This is where it started," he said. "This is where it started," she confirmed. He looked at her with the same open, unhurried attention he had given her since the morning he had stood in the ruined barn and found her calculating rather than grieving, and what was in his eyes was not diminished by time but clarified by it. The way grain is clarified by good storage, the essential thing preserved through everything. She sat with him until it was over, which was the right thing to do and the only thing she would have considered, and then she sat a while longer in the morning light, which continued to come through the east window with the complete indifference to human grief that is not cruelty but simply the nature of light. She lived into her 82nd year, active and thinking until the last months, still corresponding with agricultural practitioners through the 1920s, still answering questions at the kitchen table with the same direct precision that had been her way since before the storm. The ledgers on the study shelf became 12 by the time she was done adding to them, the first one still there in its original place. The whole series a record of decisions made carefully and knowledge applied with discipline, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had understood from the beginning that what you preserve before the storm is what survives the winter. Henry Easton, now gray-haired and distinguished and carrying his mother's eyes in his face, stood in the study after she was gone and looked at the 12 ledgers, and he took down the first one, the one from 1883, and he opened it to the first page, to the notations made in the ruined barn on the morning after the storm in the careful hand of a 24-year-old woman who had already done the calculation and already knew the answer, and was simply writing it down so that nothing would be lost. The wheat was in the field that spring, as it always was, coming up green from the preserved seed of the season before, the way things come back when they have been properly kept through the cold and the dark. The sky over Kansas was its usual impossible blue. The land stretched out in every direction with the infinite patience of something that has outlasted everything that has ever happened on it and will outlast everything yet to come. It continued, the way it always had, the way it always would. Seed enough for spring, and spring enough for everything that follows.